Hi there, Stampers. It's Christy from the Stamp Cycle here, and I have another Manic Monday video for you today. We're going to be making this card that you see here. I used a stamp set to create the rose pattern that looks like designer series paper, and then also fussy cut some roses to create that bouquet for the front there that you see with the sentiment. So for the stamp set to make the roses, we're going to be using Picture Perfect. This is from the Stampin' Up! 2016 Occasions catalog. It is a multi-step stamp set. That means there are multiple stamps that you use to create one image, like those roses you see here. Those are some masks that I created for my initial card. We'll be using those for this card and video today as well. When you create masks, you can use them over and over, so when you fussy cut something out to use as a mask, be sure to save it. I just store them in my stamp set there. We'll be using Mellow Mambo, Blushing Bride, and Pink Pirouette for the colors for our rose, as opposed to the yellow ones for today's card. When you're using these photopolymer stamps, you want to have something cushiony to stamp on. So I use this mat from Stampin' Up! That I put underneath my cardstock when I'm using these photopolymer stamps. So the first stamp that we're going to use is the most solid image. If you look on the stamp set, the images are actually numbered 1, 2, 3, and you stamp in that order. So 1, 2, 3. So this is stamp number 1, and we're going to use the lightest color of our 3 inks that we're using, and that is the Pink Pirouette. So I'm going to stamp that. I'm grouping them in 2s, and I'm going to stamp this all over this piece of, this is Whisper White. This is not the thick Whisper White. This is just the normal weighted Whisper White cardstock. So again, I'm stamping those in groups of 2 all over the background. And this is using the number 1. So then we'll take a piece of scrap Whisper White, and we're going to stamp off several roses. And these are the ones that we're going to fussy cut out to put on the front. So now I'll take the number 2 stamp in that set, and I'm using Blushing Bride. And the thing with these photopolymer stamps is you can look right through the stamp and line it up perfectly. So I'm not using a stamp positioner. I'm just looking through the stamp and lining it up with the already previously stamped images and layering the next color on top. So again, this is the number 2 in that set. And then again, I'm doing it on the roses that we stamped off on our extra piece of Whisper White that we'll be cutting out as well. You don't want to forget to do all those steps on those too. So now I am using Mellow Mambo for our 3rd stamp in our multi-step stamp set. Let's say that a few times. That's quite a mouthful. So the Mellow Mambo really pops off. The other colors there that you can see. So I went ahead and stamped the other piece as well with the Mellow Mambo. So now I'm going to stamp the flowers, or the petals. Oh my God, what are these? Leaves. I'm using Garden Green and Pear Pizzazz. And see, I've used those masks there to cover up roses, so I can have the leaves coming out from behind the roses, so it gives you a nice, more realistic look than having the leaves just floating off to the side. And I first stamped in the Garden Green using the number 3, and then I'm skipping the number 2, and I'm just using the number 1 and the number 3. So I stamped the Garden Green using the number 3, and then the Pear Pizzazz using the number 1 stamp. Hopefully you are not completely confused with what I'm saying, and it makes sense. So if you have the stamp set, you'll know what I mean, because you will see that the stamps are actually numbered 1, 2, 3. So I've gone ahead and stamped that other piece with all the leaves, and now I'm stamping 4 leaves on this extra piece of Whisper White that we're going to be cutting all of these leaves out and the roses to create that focal point on the front of our card. So now that we have everything stamped, I'm going to work on the sentiment. So I have the banner stamp from the number of years stamp set that's also in the 2016 catalog. I'm going to be stamping that and the Just a Note sentiment from that Picture Perfect stamp set with the roses. And I'm going to be heat embossing this, so I want to run my Stampin' Buddy across the cardstock there to prevent any stray embossing powder getting on our project. So first I'm going to stamp the banner in Versamark ink. And then I'm going to cover this with our gold embossing powder. This is Stampin' Up! Embossing powder. And I will knock off any excess and then layer on some more again. I use a dry paintbrush to get any stray embossing powder that might have stuck to places that I don't want it to. Be sure you're using a dry paintbrush. And then you just tap off any of the little pieces that you brush away with your paintbrush. Then I'll heat set this with my heat tool, and then I'll work on adding the Just a Note sentiment on the center there. I went ahead and ran my embossing buddy across just to make sure that when we stamp this sentiment that there isn't any stray embossing powder that gets stuck. These smaller sentiments can really get messed up with stray embossing powder, so I'm generous with the stamping buddy when stamping these types of fonts. So I'm just lining that up in the center. Again, these photopolymer stamps make it really easy to line things up and see right through the stamp and see exactly where you're stamping your image. So now that I've heat embossed both of those with the gold, I'm going to cut out this sentiment using the matching coordinating large numbers framelits. And I cut that out, ran it through my Big Shot. And now is the tedious work of fussy cutting out all of the roses and all of the leaves. So through the magic of video, I'm going to cut those out and not bore you with watching me do that. So here they are all cut out, and we're ready to start assembling our cards. So I have a piece of Blushing Bride. It's just a standard size cut in half, scored at 5.5. It's just your A2 card base. I'm going to layer on our stamped front piece here with some Tombow Mono Multi glue. I know I'm not saying that right, but I like this glue for when I'm layering because it gives me a little bit of wiggle room to really adjust to make sure I get that layer lined up perfectly, as opposed to using some other adhesives that stick very quickly. This mono glue allows me just a few seconds to play around with the placement. So now I've cut a piece of vellum that's slightly smaller than our rose stamped piece, and this just softens the flowered piece that we stamped, so it's not as harsh. I'm putting the glue in places that I think it'll be covered up with the flowers when we put that together. I also put little bits in the corner and tapped it off with my finger. I find that you can't see the adhesive when you do that. So I just dab a little bit, tap it off with my finger, and I don't see that it really shows through the vellum. So now I'm going to take some of this gold thread and I'm just winding it around my fingers to get like a circular pattern. This gold thread hates me, so I actually fussed with it for a longer time than you see in the video. So once I've wrapped it around my fingers, I just leave it in that circular pattern and just push it down onto the snail adhesive that I added to the front of our card. And I'm just going to tuck in that stray piece that's just kind of hanging out there so that isn't sticking out from underneath our flowers, because that would not look good. So now it's time to assemble our flower bouquet. I'm not the best at putting leaves and flowers together, but I thought it worked. So I'm going to use some dimensionals to pop up some of the flowers and leaves, and then I'm also going to use just some of that snail adhesive to tuck in some of the leaves behind the flowers. You know, you could lay this whole arrangement out on your card first before adhering all of it down, but since I had just made that previous card, I already knew how I wanted my flower arrangement to be. So that's an option for you if you don't want to just adhere it down without practicing first. You could lay all of this out and then go back in and adhere it all. So I've layered that first flower down with dimensionals. Now I'll lay that second flower down with dimensionals as well. So both of those are popped up off the front. And then now I'll come in here and add the leaves. And I'm using dimensionals to pop some of the leaves off, and then using some snail. So some of the leaves are tucked in right against the back of the card, and then some of them pop up with along with the roses. So now I'm going to adhere that sentiment, just a note, onto the roses, just using some snail adhesive. Since the roses already have dimension, I didn't want to also have this sentiment popping off the front as well. So I just thought that looked nice right across the front of the roses, just with some snail adhesive. All right, and then the last step in this card is to add some sequins. So I do lay my sequins down on the card to get my placement before gluing them down. Sequin placement is tricky for me, so I do usually make sure I lay my sequins out first before I glue them down. And I'm using some of our fine tip glue. This stuff is great for embellishments like sequins, small embellishments like this. It comes out clear and it really holds the sequins on there nice. I'm using my tweezers to add the sequins, and that is the card for today. So there's the yellow one that I made earlier and the pink. So thanks for joining me today, and if you have any questions, just leave me a comment, and I appreciate you joining me.